I will now describe the house. It is called Shrough End. End, yes. It is perched upon a small promontory, not exactly a peninsula, and stands indeed upon the very rocks themselves. What madman built it? The date would be perhaps 1910, but why Shrough? I have asked two of my, so far, very few local informants, the shop lady and the landlord of the village pub, and they both said, but could give no further account of the matter, that Shrough means black. Shrough? Schwartz? Most unlikely. I cannot yet discover anything about the history of the house. I never met the person described as an old lady, a Mrs. Chorney, from whom I bought it. The price was not low, and I was also compelled to purchase the almost worthless furniture and fittings. Considered as a house, Shrough End has obvious disadvantages, which I was not slow to point out to the house agent. It is mysteriously damp, and the situation is exposed and isolated. There is running water and main drainage, thank God. I have lived without these in America, but no electricity and no heating system. Cooking is by calor gas. There are also some oddities of construction which I will describe in due course. The agent, smiling, could see I loved the place, and the disadvantages meant nothing. "It is unique, sir," he said. Yes, it is. The position is inspiring, though as my village neighbors take pleasure in telling me, it will be cold and stormy in wintertime. Little do they realize how ardently I look forward to those storms, when the wild waves will beat at my very door. Since I have been here, now a matter of a few weeks, the weather has been quite distressingly calm. Yesterday the sea was so motionlessly smooth that it supported a whole flotilla of blue flies, which seemed actually to crawl upon the surface tension. From the upper seaward windows, where I am sitting at this moment, the view is total sea, unless one peers down to glimpse the rocks below. From the lower windows, however, the sea is invisible, and one sees only the coastal rocks, elephantine in size and shape, which surround the house. From the back door, which is the door of the kitchen, one emerges onto the little rock-surrounded lawn of cactus, grass, and thyme. This I shall leave to nature. I am in any case no gardener. This is the first land which I have ever owned. Nature, I note, has here provided me with a rocky seat, upon which I put cushions, and a rocky trough beside it, into which I put the pretty stones which I am collecting, so that one can sit upon the seat and examine the stones. From the front of the house a path leads along a steep-sided rocky causeway, a sort of natural drawbridge, to what is dignified by the name of the coast road. It is a tarmac road, but the kind where grass tends to grow in the middle. It is, even in May, little frequented by motor cars. I may add here that one of the secrets of my happy life is that I have never made the mistake of learning to drive a car. I have never lacked people, usually women, longing to drive me whithersoever I wanted. Why keep bitches and bark yourself? Below the causeway, on either side, there is a wilderness of small rocks, piled higgledy-piggledy by nature, and not accessible to the sea. This is a less attractive scene, and not without a few rusty tins and broken bottles, which I must one day climb down and remove. Beyond the road, the humpy yellow rocks, some of them extremely large, appear again, here set in wiry, springy grass and among innumerable flaring gorse bushes. There are also, placed there by man or nature, quite a lot of skinny fuchsias and dense veronicas, all in flower, and some kind of rather attractive grey-leaved sage. Beyond this shrubbery, there is a more barren heathland, covered with gorse and heather, and containing treacherous boggy pools, evil-smelling and full of a virulent green and reddish moss. I have not yet explored this inland country. I am not a great walker, and I am absorbed and contented by my seaside paradise. Upon this heath, incidentally, and about 1.5 miles from Shrough End, is the nearest dwelling, a place called a Morn Farm. From my upstairs front windows I can see their lights at night. The coast road, if followed to the right, curves round into the next bay, which is invisible from Shrough End territory, except at the tower which stands on the promontory. Here, at a distance of 3 or 4 miles, is an establishment called the Raven Hotel, about which I have mixed feelings, since it is a place of some pretension which attracts tourists. The bay itself is very beautiful, being fringed by rather remarkable, almost spherical boulders. It is known locally as Raven Bay, after the hotel, though it has some other name, something like Shahor in the local dialect. Shore Bay? Why? If followed to the left from Shrough End, the coast road passes through a curious narrow defile, which I have nicknamed the Khyber Pass, where the way is being cut through a big outcrop of rock, which here invades the land to a considerable distance. Beyond this, there is a very small stony beach. This is the only beach in the area, since elsewhere, a feature which originally attracted me to this coastline, there is deepish water up against the rocks at any state of the tide. Beyond the beach, a footpath leads diagonally to the village, which is set a little inland. But if one continues to follow the road, one reaches a very pretty little harbour with a magnificently built crooked stone quay, all silted up and entirely abandoned. There used to be fishing boats here, I gather, but these now operate only from further north. I sometimes see them upon my otherwise remarkably empty tract of sea. Beyond the harbour, a long and quite broad shelving slope has been cut in the rock to form what is known as the ladies' bathing place. I have seen no ladies there, only occasionally a few boys. The local people hardly ever swim. They seem to regard the activity as a form of madness. In fact, the ladies' bathing place is now so overgrown with slippery brown weed and so strewn with boulders tossed in by the sea that it is scarcely safer than anywhere else. The coast road here becomes a track, unfortunately suitable for motor cars, which climbs up into a wild region, which I have not yet had time to explore, where my yellow rocks turn into handsome and quite sizable cliffs. The tarmac road turns inland to the village and beyond. The village is called Narrowdean. The old form of the name was Nerrodeen, and a handsome milestone upon the coast road retains this spelling. The little place consists of a few streets of stone-built cottages, some hillside bungalows, and one general shop. I cannot get the Times, or any batteries for my exhausted transistor radio, but this does not worry me too much, nor am I dismayed by the total absence of a butcher's shop. There is one pub, the Black Lion. The cottages are charming, solidly built in the yellowish local stone, but the only building of any special architectural interest is the church, a fine 18th century structure with a gallery. I am, of course, not a churchgoer, but I was glad to find that there are services, though only once a month. The church is well kept and regularly provided with flowers. The distant sound of bells, which I sometimes hear, comes, I think, from an equally tiny village lying inland beyond a moorland farm, where the country is gentler and there is grazing for sheep. There is no rectory or manor house in Narrowdean, not that it was ever part of my plan to hobnob with the parson and the squire. I am also glad to intuit that the place is not infested with intellectuals, a hazard everywhere nowadays. To return to the church, there is a most attractive cimetière marin, which evidences a more spacious past than one would expect this one-horse village to possess. Many of the tombstones carry carvings of sailing ships, decorative anchors, and strangely eloquent whales. Could men have gone whaling from here? One stone in particular attracts me. It bears a beautiful foul anchor and the simple inscription, Dummy, 1879 to 1918. This puzzled me until I realized that Dummy must have been a deaf and dumb sailor who never managed to achieve any other identity. Poor chap. Let us now come back again to Shrough End. The facade, which looks onto the road, is, I suppose, not in itself remarkable, but in its lonely situation is strangely incongruous. The house is a brick-built, double-fronted villa with bay windows on the ground floor and 2 peaks to the roof. The bricks are dark red. It would scarcely attract notice in a Birmingham suburb, but all alone upon that wild coast it certainly looks odd. The back has been horribly pebble-dashed, no doubt against the weather. An expert could probably date the house from the pale buff-coloured blinds which survive in almost every room in excellent condition, with glossy wooden toggles on strings, silk tassels, and a lace fringe at the bottom. When these blinds, expressive word, are drawn down, Shrough End, seen from the road, has a weird air of complacent mystery, while within, the yellow light of the blinded room somehow and sadly recalls my childhood, perhaps the atmosphere of my grandfather's house in Lincolnshire. The 2 bay-window rooms I have christened the book room, where I have put my crates of books, still not unpacked, and the dining room, where I store my wine. But I live entirely on the seaward side of the house, upstairs in my bedroom, and what I am determined to call my drawing room. the downstairs in the kitchen, and a small den next to it which I call the Little Red Room. Here there is a good fireplace, with traces of wood fire, and also a decent bamboo table and bamboo armchair. The walls have white wooden panels on the lower part, above which they are painted tomato red, an exotic touch not matched elsewhere in the house. The kitchen, with the callow gas stove, is paved with the most enormous slate flags I have ever seen. There is, of course, no refrigerator, which is dismaying to a fish-eating man. There is a large larder full of woodlice. All the downstairs woodwork tends to be damp. I prized up some linoleum in the hall and replaced it with a shutter. There was a salty smell. Is it conceivable that the sea could be rising up through a hidden channel under the house? I suppose I ought to have had a surveyor's report, but I was in too much of a hurry. There is an old-fashioned mechanical front doorbell with a brass handle and a long wire. It rings in the kitchen. The chief peculiarity of the house, and one for which I can produce no rational explanation, is that on the ground floor and on the first floor there is an inner room. By this I mean that there is, between the front room and the back room, a room which has no external window, but is lit by an internal window giving on to the adjacent seaward room, the drawing room upstairs, the kitchen downstairs. These two funny inner rooms are extremely dark and entirely empty, except for a large sagging sofa in the downstairs one and a small table in the upstairs one, where there is also a remarkable decorative cast-iron lamp bracket, the only one in the house. I shall certainly not occupy these rooms. Later on, by the removal of walls, they shall enlarge the drawing room and the dining room. The whole house is indeed sparsely furnished. I have introduced very little of my own. There is only one bed. I am not expecting visitors. This emptiness suits me. Unlike James, I am not a collector or clutterer. I am even becoming fond of some of the stuff which I complain so much about having to buy. I am especially attached to a large oval mirror in the hall. Mrs. Chorney's things seem to belong. It is my own. Few, in fact, possessions which look out of place. I sold a great many things when I left the big flat in Barnes, and removed most of the remainder to a tiny pied-à-terre in Shepherd's Bush, where I pushed them in anyhow and locked the door. I rather dread going back there. I cannot now think why I bothered to keep a London base at all. My friends told me I must have one. I say my friends, but how few, as I take stock, they really are after a lifetime in the theatre. How friendly and warm-hearted the theatre can seem, what a desolation it can be. The great ones have gone from me. Clement Mackin dead, Wilfred Dunning dead, Sidney Ash gone to Stratford, Ontario, Fritzie Eitel successful and done for in California. A handful remain, Perry, Al, Marcus, Gilbert, what's left of the girls. I am beginning to ramble. It is evening. The sea is golden, speckled with white points of light, lapping with a sort of mechanical self-satisfaction under a pale green sky. How huge it is. How empty, this great space for which I have been longing all my life. Still no letters. The sea is noisier today, and the seagulls are crying. I do not really like silence except in the theatre. The sea is agitated, a very dark blue with white crests. I went out looking for driftwood as far as the little stony beach. The tide was low, so I could not swim off the tower steps, and until I can get some handholds fixed, I think I shall shun my cliff, except in calm weather. I swam at the beach, but it was not a success. The pebbles hurt my feet, and I had great difficulty in getting out, since the beach shelves and the waves kept tumbling the pebbles down against me. I came back really cold and disgruntled, and forgot the wood which I had collected. I have now had lunch, lentil soup followed by chipolata sausages, served with boiled onions and apples stewed in tea, then dried apricots and shortcake biscuits, a light Beaujolais, and I feel better. Fresh apricots are best, of course, but the dried kind, soaked for 24 hours and then well drained, make a heavenly accompaniment for any sort of mildly sweet biscuit or cake. They are especially good with anything made of almonds, and thus consort happily with red wine. I am not a great friend of your peach, but I suspect the apricot is the king of fruit. I shall now go and have an afternoon rest. It is night. 2 oil lamps, purring very faintly, shed a calm, creamy light upon the scratched and stained surface of what was once a fine rosewood table, the erstwhile property of Mrs. Chorney. This is my working table at the window of the drawing-room, though I also use the little folding table, which I have brought in from the inner room, to lay out books and papers. I have had to shut the window against the moths, huge ones with beige and orange wings, who have been coming in like little helicopters. The lamps, there are 4 in all, and in good working order, are also Chorneyana. They are handsome, old-fashioned things, rather heavy, made of brass with graceful opaque glass shades. I learnt to master oil lamps in the USA in that hut with Fritzie. 2 paraffin heaters downstairs remain, however, a mystery. I must get new ones before chillier nights arrive. Last night was chilly enough. I attempted to light a driftwood fire in the little red room, but the wood was too damp and the chimney smoked. I think that in winter I shall live downstairs. How I look forward to it. The drawing-room is still more of a lookout point than a room. It is dominated by a tall black-painted wooden chimney-piece with a lot of little shelves with little mirrors above them. A collector's item, no doubt, but it looks a little too like the altar of some weird sect. It has that oriental, vegetable look. Before I lit the lamps tonight, I spent some time simply gazing out at the moonlight, always an astonishment and a joy to the town dweller. It is so bright now over the rocks that I could read by it. Only, oddly enough, I note that I have no impulse to read since I have been here. A good sign. Writing seems to have replaced reading. Yet also, I seem to be constantly putting off the moment when I begin to give a formal account of myself. I was born at the turn of the century in the town of... or whatever. There will be time and motive enough to prose on about my life when I shall have generated, as it were, a sufficient cloud of reflection. I am still almost shy of my emotions, shy of the terrible strength of certain memories. Simply the tale of my years with Clement could fill a volume. I am very conscious of the house existing quietly round about me. Parts of it I have colonized, other parts remain obstinately alien and dim. The entrance hall is dark and pointless, except for the presence of the large oval mirror aforementioned. This handsome object seems to glow with its own light. I do not altogether like the stairs. Spirits from the past linger on the stairs. These lead halfway up, via a narrow branching stairway, to a surprisingly large bathroom which faces the road, and from which, behind an odd little door, more steps lead to the attics. The bathroom has some good original tiles representing swans and sinuous lilies. There is a huge, much-stained bath on lion's paws, with excellent, enormous brass taps. There is no system for heating the water, however. A hip bath in a downstairs cupboard represents, I suspect, the reality of the situation. There is also a notice in a continental hand giving useful instructions about how to make the lavatory work. The main staircase turns inward to reach the space of the upper landing. I call this a space because it is a rather odd area with an atmosphere all its own. It has the expectant air of a stage set. Sometimes I feel as if I have seen it long ago in a dream. It is a big, windowless oblong, lit during the day through open doors and adorned, just opposite the inner room, by a solid oak stand upon which there is a large, remarkably hideous green vase, with a thick neck and a scalloped rim, and pink roses blistering its bulging sides. I have become very attached to this gross object. Beyond it there is a shallow alcove which looks as if it should contain a statue, but empty resembles a door. After this comes the most fascinating feature of the landing, an archway containing a bead curtain. This curtain is not unlike those which exclude flies from shops in Mediterranean countries. The beads are of wood, painted yellow and black, and they click lightly together as one passes through. After the archway come the doors of my bedroom and drawing room. It is time for bed. Behind me is the long horizontal window, several feet up in the wall, which gives on to the inner room. As I rise, I am impelled to look towards it, seeing my face reflected in the black glass as in a mirror. I have never suffered from night fears. I was never, that I can recall, afraid of the dark as a child. My mother early impressed upon me that fear of the dark was a superstition from which God-trusting people did not suffer. I hardly needed God to protect me. My parents were an absolute defense against every terror. It is not that I find Shroff End in any way creepy. It is just that, as it now suddenly occurs to me, this is the first time in my life that I have been really alone at night. My childhood home, theatrical digs in the provinces, London flats, hotels, rented apartments in capital cities, I have always lived in hives, surrounded by human presences behind walls. And even when I lived in that hut with Fritzi, I was never alone. This is the first house which I have owned, and the first genuine solitude which I have inhabited. Is this not what I wanted? Of course, the house is full of little creaking, straining noises, even on a windless night, any elderly houses, and draughts blow through it from gappy window frames and ill-fitting doors. So it is that I can imagine, as I lie in bed at night, that I hear soft footsteps in the attics above me, or that the bead curtain on the landing is quietly clicking because someone has passed furtively through it. Perhaps this is a foolish moment, so late at night, to choose to approach the subject, but it has come suddenly and vividly into my head. The reader, if there is one, may wonder why I have not referred again to a horrible experience which I suffered here, beside the sea, but could not bring myself to describe. It might seem by now that I had forgotten it, and indeed, in an odd way, I think I had forgotten it, a tendency which is evidence, perhaps, for one possible view of the phenomenon. Let me now describe what happened. I was sitting with this notebook beside me upon the rocks just above my cliff and looking out over the water. The sun was shining, the sea was calm, as I have described it in the first paragraph of this notebook. Shortly before this, I had been looking intently into a rock pool and watching a remarkably long, reddish, faintly bristly sea worm which had wreathed itself into curious coils prior to disappearing into a hole. I sat up, then settled myself facing seaward, blinking in the sun. Then, not at once, but after 2 minutes, as my eyes became accustomed to the glare, I saw a monster rising from the waves. I can describe this in no other way. Out of a perfectly calm, empty sea, at a distance of perhaps a quarter of a mile or less, I saw an immense creature break the surface and arch itself upward. At first it looked like a black snake. Then a long, thickening body with a ridgy, spiny back followed the elongated neck. There was something which might have been a flipper or perhaps a fin. I could not see the whole of the creature, but the remainder of its body, or perhaps a long tail, disturbed the foaming water round the base of what had now risen from the sea to a height of, as it seemed, 20 or 30 feet. The creature then coiled itself so that the long neck circled twice, bringing the now conspicuous head low down above the surface of the sea. I could see the sky through the coils. I could also see the head with remarkable clarity, a kind of crested snake's head, green-eyed, the mouth opening to show teeth and a pink interior. The head and neck glistened with a blue sheen. Then, in a moment, the whole thing collapsed, the coils fell, the undulating back still broke the water, and then there was nothing but a great, foaming, swirling pool where the creature had vanished. The shock and the horror of it was so great that for some time I could not move. I wanted to run away. I feared beyond anything that the animal would reappear closer to land, perhaps rising up at my very feet. But my legs would not function, and my heart was beating so violently that any further exertion might have rendered me unconscious. The sea had become calm again, and nothing further happened. At last I got up and walked slowly back to the house. I went up the stairs and into the drawing room, where I sat for some time, just breathing carefully and holding my heart. I could not bear to take my usual place at the window, so I sat at the little table against the wall of the inner room, leaning my head against the wall, and about half an hour later I was able to write down what now appears as the second paragraph in this notebook. During that time, as I held on to myself and breathed and trembled, I managed gradually to think about what had occurred. Thought, rational thought, which had been utterly routed, returned gradually to my rescue. Something had happened, and happenings have explanations. Several possible explanations came before me, and as I began to number and classify and relate them, some relief came, and the awful unconceptualized terror receded. It was possible that I had simply imagined what I saw, but of course one does not simply imagine anything so detailed and dreadful. It later struck me as significant that the creature had appeared at once as utterly frightful, rather than as very surprising or even interesting. I was excessively frightened. I am a moderate drinker, and certainly not an unbalanced or crazily imaginative person. Another possibility was that I had, again simply, seen a monster unknown to science. Well, that was just possible. Or was what I had seen an absolutely enormous eel? Could there be such an eel? Did eels ever rise up out of the sea and wreathe themselves into coils and balance themselves high in the air? I could not think that the thing was an eel. This was impossible. It had a substantial body. I had seen its back. I was quite sure, too, that I could not have seen a mere eel, however large, as this coiling monstrosity through which I had looked at the sky. How far off had the animal been, and how high above the water had it risen? On further reflection, I was not so certain of my first impressions, though I remained sure that I had seen something absolutely remarkable. Explanations in terms of floating seaweed or bobbing driftwood were not to be considered. I explored another possibility. Just before I saw my huge monster, I had been closely inspecting, in the rock pool, a little monster, the red bristling worm, whose 5 or 6 inches of wriggling body appeared big in the confined space of the pool. Was it possible that through some purely optical mechanism, some unusual trick of the retina, I had thrown the image of the worm out onto the surface of the sea? This was an interesting idea, but totally implausible, since the red worm bore no resemblance to the bluish-blackish monster, except insofar as both of them had wreathed into coils. Besides, I had never heard of any such retinal cinematography. I was struck, on reflection, by the fact that I had recalled the creature with extreme clarity. The visual impression remained extremely detailed, while at the same time I felt more and more vague about its exact distance away from me. The solution which I now think to be the most probable, though whether I shall continue to think so remains to be seen, is this, and I record it with a little shame. I am neither a drunkard nor a drug addict. I scarcely ever drink spirits. I have smoked hash occasionally in America. However, on one occasion, several years ago, I was idiot enough to take a dose of LSD. I did it to please a woman. I had what is known as a bad trip. It was a very bad trip. I shall not attempt to describe what I experienced on that dreadful and rather shameful occasion. I will only add, it concerned entrails. In fact, it would be extremely hard, even impossible, to put it properly into words. It was something morally, spiritually horrible, as if one's stinking inside had emerged and become the universe, a surging emanation of dark, half-formed spiritual evil, something never ever to be escaped from. Undetachable, I remember, was a word which somehow came along with the impression of it. In fact, the visual images involved were dreadfully clear and, as it were, authoritative ones, and they are rising up in front of me at this moment. And I will not write about them. Of course, I never took LSD again. I had no further after effects, and after a while I began mercifully to forget the experience in the quite special way in which one forgets a dream. However, it is possible, perhaps plausible, to conjecture that the sea monster which I saw was a hallucination which was also caused by my one foolish experiment with that awful drug. It is true that the rising, coiling monster did not really resemble what I saw on the first occasion, any more than it resembled the red worm in the pool, but the feeling of horror was similar in quality, or at any rate began to seem so very soon after the experience itself. Also, the quality of the tendency to forget also now seems to me to be similar in the two cases. A bad trip can recur in this way, I am told. Readers, be warned. However, it must be admitted that as I reflect about it all at this moment, the strongest evidence for this explanation is the total implausibility of all the others. My heart is beating violently again. I must go to bed. Perhaps I should have waited until tomorrow morning to tell this story. I shall take a sleeping pill.